Hello everyone, welcome to session 13 of LTEC 623 Digital Video Design. In this video, we're going to talk about three things. First, let's discuss the value of effective charge in educational videos. Then we're going to review what doesn't work with instructional video. And then finally, we'll transition to post-production for Video Project 2. So let's get started. So this week's reading was about effective charge of educational videos. The premise of the article was that learning with media is always associated with affective qualities. And of course, affect is the experience of feeling or emotion, and typically, affect is measured along two dimensions. Valence, meaning is it a positive emotion or a negative emotion, and arousal, in the sense of is it an activating or deactivating experience. Now, this is important to educators because we know that there are affective influences in learning with media. For example, learners' moods, as opposed to a concrete emotion such as being happy or angry. A mood is more of a long-lasting affective state. And these are rather diffuse and often labeled as a good, neutral, or bad mood. Now, why is this important? Well, research has shown that positive mood is associated with higher attention, better information processing, and increased creativity and problem-solving skills. Now, in addition to the mood of the learner, the learning environment itself can also have an emotional charge. In short, learning environments can induce positive or negative emotions through their design. Media which induce positive emotions are found to significantly influence learning-relevant cognitive mechanisms like memory, attention, and perception. So if we are designing instructional materials or instructional media, we need to be keeping in mind both the learner's mood and the emotional charge of the media we are creating. That's kind of the premise of this particular article. So why are we interested in this study? Well, we're interested in this study for two reasons. One, of course, it's about the design of instructional or educational videos. And number two, I like it because I think it's a very well-designed experimental study focusing on video. So this particular study employed a classic 2x2 research design. And so on the one hand, they took into account the mood of the learner, which they divided into a neutral category and a positive category. And then the other half of the 2x2 grid was the effective charge of video. And again, that was either positive in charge or neutral in charge. And then they randomly assigned participants in the study to one of these conditions in the 2x2 grid. And of course, they were also interested in the mood-affect congruency effect, this idea that if the effective charge of the video and the mood of the learner work together in a congruent fashion, there may be some learning benefits. So, what were the measures used in this particular study? Well, they focused on aspects of emotion, valence, arousal, and dominance. They also focused on aspects of cognitive load, in other words, what's happening in terms of cognitive processing. They had two measures there, mental load and mental effort. And finally, they had aspects of learning. They kept track of the participants' prior knowledge. They also kept track of retention of information shared in the video, as well as their ability to transfer that knowledge to a new context. So these were the measures they used. So an important question is, how did the researchers alter the effective charge of the videos? Well, first and foremost, they acknowledged that every scene used in the videos were shot twice. They used the same female lecturer, the same script, there were no hand gestures, the same amount of eye contact with the camera was used in both shoots. They maintained identical perspectives and as much as possible tried to use the exact same speaking tempo. And then any footage with a distracting background, such as somebody walking across the frame, was taken out. So as much as possible, they tried to keep things the same. However, what did they intentionally change? Well, for the positively charged video, the lecturer smiled more and used a friendly intonation of voice. In contrast, the neutrally charged video included only neutral facial expressions and an unemotional intonation of the voice, which they argued was nearly monotonous in its sound. So, what were the findings? Well, they found that in terms of retention, students viewing video with a positive affective charge outperform students viewing the more neutral video. In other words, videos with a positive affective charge help students retain information. The second major finding was students viewing video with a positive affective charge reported significantly lower mental load. And the authors argue there are two important takeaways here. They found evidence for the emotion as facilitator hypothesis can be transferred to video. In other words, the emotional design of media applies to educational video. And secondly, they argue they have evidence that videos with a positive affective charge direct attention toward the material and focuses cognitive resources on relevant information. And that's why, according to the authors, that video with a positive affective charge helps students retain information and report lower levels of mental load. Okay, so that's a very interesting study. Now I want to transition back to the Fiorella and Mayer article and what doesn't work with instructional video. Last week we talked about segmenting and multiple perspectives as actually helping learners when it comes to using video. Let's take a look at some things that have been studied that don't work. Well, one of the things that was tested was seeing the instructor. So the question of this study was, does the mere presence of an instructor in a video alter attention and learning? The rationale of this particular study is that instructors will attract learners' attention, but this may come at the expense of attention to what is actually being explained or demonstrated in the video. And so the authors wanted to know, will this affect learning? So they had 54 participants and they tracked their eye movements while they were observing video examples on probability calculations that did or did not show the instructor. And then after they watched the videos, participants had to solve probability problems like those presented in the video. So what did they find? Well, instructor presence actually may be distracting, and they did not find any evidence that it improves student learning. And they argue that we should only show the instructor if he or she is engaged in activities intended to direct students' cognitive processing. And so if you take a look at the screenshot on the right-hand side here, you can see what it looked like with and without the instructor. So this particular study found no evidence that seeing the instructor matters. Another study that doesn't seem to work is model-observer similarity. So the question of this study was, does the effectiveness of a modeling example differ as a function of the gender of the model and the observer? Of course, the model is the person in the video, and the observer, in this case, is the student. The rationale is people might see themselves as learners and try harder to learn from an instructional video when they have rapport with the on-screen instructor. Kind of makes sense. Now, the model-observer similarity hypothesis predicts that learners who perceive themselves to be more similar to the model will learn more from the examples and show greater self-efficacy gains. So they conducted an experiment with 159 secondary students who watched two modeling examples, either by a male or female model. All of the example content in the videos was exactly the same. So what did they find? Well, students perceived models of the same gender as more similar to them. However, matching for model gender did not significantly impact learning, self-efficacy, or the perceived competence of the model. In other words, it didn't have an impact on learning or how students viewed themselves. Another thing that was studied, inserting pauses. So what was the question? Well, the researchers wanted to know, will inserting pauses into instructional videos enhance learning? The rationale, of course, is that pauses may reduce the amount of information students must process concurrently, and/or pauses may help structure the lesson by segmenting it into meaningful units. So their experiment, they had adults watch a video about acoustic oscillations, and they had 4 conditions described here. What were the findings? They found no significant differences among the conditions on retention, transfer, and/or self-reported cognitive load. And surprisingly, overall, 3-second pauses did not seem to have a strong and consistent effect on learning outcomes. In other words, inserting pauses in this manner did not support learning. Now, I want to contrast this to last week's example of segmenting. Now, when an expert segments video content into meaningful chunks, that does help the learner learn. But simply inserting pauses within the video doesn't necessarily help learning. So that's a subtle but important difference that we need to keep in mind as designers of educational videos. Okay, so let's move on now to video project 2. Of course, we are into session 13, which is very exciting, and we're moving on to post-production. And that means we are going to edit, finalize, and review our Chalk and Talk videos. So this week, you're focusing on post-production. So again, just like before, I need you to choose your video editor. Some of you will probably use WeVideo again or something else. If you need to, feel free to revisit those how-to videos. When you edit your video, really focus on nice, tight, and concise video editing. Remove any unwanted footage, add in transitions, create a narrative flow by arranging and rearranging your scenes, add effects and music as necessary. Be sure to add in a title sequence, credits, and lower thirds if applicable. And then when you're ready, go ahead and publish your final video and share the link just like you did with Video Project 1. Okay, everyone, we're out of time for today. Have a great week. I'll see you in Canvas.